The dressing room door at NBC Studios trembled under the weight of what was about to happen. December 17, 1969, 7:43 p.m. In 13 minutes, Tiny Tim would walk onto the Tonight Show stage and marry 17-year-old Miss Vicki in front of more people than had ever watched a wedding in human history. What he didn't know yet was that NBC executives were placing bets on whether America's strangest love story would make them rich or destroy them both. The smell of 10,000 imported Dutch tulips drifted through the studio corridors like funeral flowers, and in 17 minutes, Tiny Tim's entire understanding of love, fame, and human decency would shatter under the brightest lights television had ever assembled. Herbert Carey sat in front of the mirror, adjusting his Victorian collar for the 100th time. His hands shook as he touched the vintage lace cuffs that had been specially sewn for this moment. At 37, he still called every woman Miss out of respect, still believed that marriage was sacred, still thought that television was simply a way to share the beautiful songs from 1890 to 1930 that lived in his heart. The burgundy velvet jacket felt heavy on his shoulders, authentic 1860s tailoring that had cost NBC more than most people made in a month. But something felt wrong. The excitement in the hallways wasn't the gentle joy he'd expected. It was predatory, electric, commercial.
5 minutes, Mr. Tim?
The stage manager's voice cut through his thoughts. Through the dressing room wall, he could hear Johnny Carson's monologue ending to thunderous applause. 45 million Americans were settling into their living rooms, anticipating something they'd never seen before, a real wedding on live television. Carson's voice carried through the studio speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to witness television history. This is not a publicity stunt. This is a real ceremony that will legally join two people in marriage, and you're all invited. The audience erupted again, and Tiny Tim felt his stomach twist into knots that had nothing to do with pre-wedding nerves. Earlier that day, Victoria Budinger had sat in her own dressing room, tears streaming down her 17-year-old face. "I wanted to get married at home," she whispered to her mother through the phone, her voice barely audible over the chaos of NBC's preparation. "In our living room with Pastor Mitchell like we planned." But the contracts had been signed, the tulips ordered, the cameras positioned. When Johnny Carson had asked Tiny Tim on live television 2 months earlier if he'd consider marrying Miss Vicki on the show, Herbert had been so overwhelmed by the honor, so touched by Carson's apparent friendship, that he'd said yes without consulting anyone. Not NBC's lawyers, not Miss Vicki, not even his own heart, which had been dreaming of a quiet ceremony where he could focus on the sacred vows, not the television ratings. The truth about NBC's intentions had leaked just hours before the wedding. A production assistant, guilt-ridden and probably drunk, had confessed to a journalist that the network's research department had commissioned studies on May-December romance scandal appeal. They'd tested the story with focus groups. Elderly novelty singer marries teenager. The data was overwhelming. America couldn't look away. The age gap, Tiny Tim's bizarre appearance, his Victorian mannerisms, his obvious sexual inexperience, it was a perfect storm of voyeuristic entertainment. NBC executives had privately referred to it as the freak show wedding, though none of them would have dared say those words around Tiny Tim himself. They'd discovered that his earnest, innocent belief in traditional courtship was exactly what made the whole thing so deliciously uncomfortable to watch. Johnny Carson himself had started having second thoughts the night before. Sitting in his office at 11 p.m., he'd stared at the mountain of publicity materials NBC had prepared. Headlines that hadn't been written yet but were already planned. The wedding America can't stop watching. Love or spectacle. The night TV went too far. Carson had built his career on showcasing unusual guests, but this felt different. Tiny Tim wasn't in on the joke. He genuinely believed this was an honor, a celebration of love on America's most prestigious stage. Carson had picked up the phone 3 times to call the whole thing off, but each time he'd remembered the ratings projections, the advertising revenue, the television history they were about to make. He'd set the phone down and poured another drink. Places, everyone. The wedding march began to play, but it wasn't the traditional version. NBC's musical director had arranged a medley that included Tiptoe Through the Tulips, turning even the processional into a reminder of Tiny Tim's novelty status. Herbert straightened his shoulders and walked toward the stage, his mind focused on the sacred vows he was about to make. Behind him, a production assistant held a clipboard with the real ratings goal written at the top. 50 million viewers by 11:30 p.m. The number had been circled in red. In the margins, someone had written goldmine in capital letters. But Tiny Tim saw none of this. He was thinking about love, about commitment, about the beautiful Victorian songs he would sing for Miss Vicki after the ceremony. The studio lights hit him like a physical force as he stepped onto the stage. The set was breathtaking. 10,000 white tulips arranged in elaborate displays that stretched from floor to ceiling, creating a garden paradise that looked like something from a fairy tale. The audience of 300 people rose to their feet, applauding and cheering, but there was something strange about the sound. It was too enthusiastic, too excited, like a crowd at a boxing match rather than a wedding. Tiny Tim smiled and waved, his heart swelling with gratitude. He thought they were celebrating love. He didn't realize they were celebrating the spectacle he'd become, the collision between his sincere Victorian values and 1960s America's appetite for the bizarre. Miss Vicki appeared at the back of the studio, and for a moment, the entire audience fell silent. She looked beautiful and terrified, her 18-year-old face pale under the television lights, her hands trembling as she held a bouquet of white tulips. The dress was perfect, authentic 1860s design with layers of silk and lace that rustled with each step. But her eyes were red from crying, and anyone who looked closely could see that she was barely holding herself together. The camera operators had been specifically instructed to capture her emotions, to zoom in on any sign of doubt or distress. NBC's research had shown that audience engagement peaked when the bride appeared uncertain. They wanted America to wonder, will she go through with it? Is she making a terrible mistake? Johnny Carson stood at the makeshift altar, looking genuinely moved despite his private reservations. As a performer, he understood the magnitude of what was happening. This wasn't just television, it was cultural history. But as he watched Tiny Tim's face light up when he saw Miss Vicki, Carson felt something he rarely experienced on his show: genuine emotion. Herbert's joy was so pure, so untainted by cynicism or calculation, that for a moment Carson forgot about the cameras and the ratings, and remembered what weddings were supposed to be about. The two figures approached each other slowly, Herbert in his burgundy velvet, Miss Vicki in her white silk, and 45 million Americans leaned forward in their chairs, unsure whether they were witnessing a love story or a tragedy. The ceremony began with words that would be remembered for decades. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here tonight in the sight of God and this television audience." The phrase television audience hung in the air strangely, a reminder that this intimate moment was being broadcast into living rooms across America. Tiny Tim barely noticed. He was looking into Miss Vicki's eyes, seeing past her nervousness to the shy young woman who had stolen his heart with her genuine kindness. He'd courted her with the old-fashioned respect his grandmother had taught him, bringing flowers, asking permission from her parents, treating her like a precious Victorian lady in an era when most men her age offered nothing but casual disregard. But as the vows progressed, something in the audience's energy began to shift. The initial excitement was giving way to something else, a kind of uncomfortable fascination, like watching a car accident in slow motion. In living rooms across America, families were gathered around their television sets, but the conversations weren't about love or romance. They were about the strangeness of it all, the age difference, Tiny Tim's peculiar mannerisms, the way he seemed to genuinely believe in fairy tale romance while surrounded by the cold machinery of television production. NBC executives watched from the control room, tracking the ratings in real time as they climbed higher than anyone had dared to predict. "Do you, Herbert, take Victoria to be your lawfully wedded wife?" The question echoed through the studio, and for just a moment, Tiny Tim hesitated. Not because he doubted his love for Miss Vicki, but because something in the audience's laughter felt wrong. They weren't laughing with him, they were laughing at him, at his earnest Victorian romanticism, at his belief that love should be pure and courtly and sacred. But he pushed the doubt aside and answered in his sweet, high voice, "I do with all my heart, God bless you." The phrase "God bless you" was quintessential Tiny Tim. He said it to everyone, always a reflexive blessing that came from genuine goodness. The audience loved it, but their affection felt increasingly like the kind reserved for a performing pet. Miss Vicki's vows were barely audible, her voice trembling as she promised to love and honor the man who had swept her off her feet with his gentle courtliness and genuine respect. She was so young, so overwhelmed by the lights and cameras and the weight of 45 million people watching her most intimate moment. When she said "I do," her voice cracked, and NBC's cameras captured every nuance of her emotion, broadcasting her vulnerability to a nation that couldn't decide whether to feel protective of her or complicit in what felt increasingly like exploitation. The control room erupted in subdued cheers as the ratings hit 47 million and kept climbing. The ring exchange was where the surreal nature of the whole event became impossible to ignore. As Tiny Tim slipped the band onto Miss Vicki's finger, the studio audience burst into applause that seemed more appropriate for a variety show act than a sacred ceremony. Carson, watching from the side, felt a deep unease settle in his stomach. This was his show, his idea, his responsibility, and he was beginning to understand that they had crossed a line that shouldn't have been crossed. But it was too late to stop. The machinery of live television ground forward remorselessly, carrying everyone along toward the moment that would define this night forever. "You may kiss the bride." The words hung in the air for what felt like an eternity. Tiny Tim leaned down to kiss Miss Vicki, and in that moment something shifted in the American consciousness. This wasn't just entertainment anymore, it was intimacy made public, vulnerability transformed into spectacle. The kiss was gentle, chaste, exactly what anyone who knew Tiny Tim would have expected. But the audience's reaction was explosive, a mixture of cheers and awkward laughter that filled the studio with a sound unlike anything that had ever accompanied a wedding ceremony. In that moment, 48 million Americans became witnesses to something that felt both beautiful and deeply wrong. As the ceremony concluded and the newlyweds turned to face the audience, Tiny Tim's face radiated pure joy. He had married the woman he loved on national television, surrounded by tulips and witnessed by more people than had ever seen a wedding before. But in the control room, NBC executives were already planning how to market this moment, how to turn it into promotional materials, how to maximize the commercial value of what they'd just captured. The wedding had been beautiful and grotesque, sincere and exploitative, a perfect reflection of 1960s America's complicated relationship with innocence and celebrity. And Tiny Tim, waving to the audience with his new bride at his side, still didn't fully understand that he had just been turned into the most famous freak show in television history. 27 years later, as Tiny Tim collapsed on stage singing Tiptoe Through the Tulips for the last time, his final thoughts weren't of fame or television or the millions of people who had watched him marry Miss Vicki. They were of that moment when he had looked into her eyes and promised to love her forever, surrounded by 10,000 tulips and the brightest lights he had ever seen. The wedding had been both the peak of his career and the beginning of its end, the moment when America fell in love with him and decided he was too strange to take seriously. But for those 6 minutes on December 17, 1969, Tiny Tim had been exactly what he always wanted to be, a man in love, sharing that love with the world, believing that beauty and sincerity could triumph over cynicism and exploitation. The marriage lasted 8 years. The television ratings record lasted until Johnny Carson's final show in 1992. But the questions raised that night about privacy and publicity, love and spectacle, innocence and exploitation remain unanswered, echoing through every reality show wedding, every celebrity ceremony, every moment when private joy becomes public entertainment. Tiny Tim had wanted to share his happiness with America. America had wanted to consume his strangeness. In the end, both got exactly what they wished for, though neither quite understood what they were asking for until it was far too late to turn off the cameras. If this story of love, innocence, and television's power to transform sacred moments into spectacle moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to remember that some moments are too precious for public consumption. Have you ever had a private moment turn into public entertainment? Have you witnessed someone's vulnerability being exploited for others' amusement? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more untold stories about the collision between genuine human emotion and the relentless machinery of fame.